American corporations were once the envy of the world, viewed as leaders in innovation and management practices, and as creators of good jobs. But after a decade of continuous layoffs, accounting scandals, excessively paid CEOs, and mind-numbing consolidations, the American corporation doesn't have such a glowing reputation anymore. What does this rise in anti-corporate sentiment really mean? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is Bruce Nussbaum, the editorial page writer of Business Week magazine, who has written about businesses and their behavior for over 20 years. Bruce, it's good to have you here today.
Good to be here, Sarah.
So if you listen to people like Nader, who calls it a major evil, or Norman Mailer, who calls it this spiritually deadening the big empty, there's a lot of criticism emerging about corporations today. How real is that from where you sit?
I think it's quite real. You know, if you remember just a few years ago in the 90s, people really had very positive feelings toward big corporations. You talk about eBay or Amazon or any of those things. They had great shine to them, and people wanted to start their own companies and scale them up and build big things. Now, corporations, after some very rough years, are heavily criticized, and it's a growing thing. You know, people are criticizing corporations for outsourcing overseas and offshoring. They're criticizing them for drilling in Moab and all the great places out in the West. They're criticizing them for going overseas and looking for cheap labor and paying bad wages. They're criticizing them for being very active in lobbying in Washington and doing bad things there. There are criticisms over a whole range of things, and it's really infecting different segments of the population, and the corporations themselves feel quite under siege. So it's a real thing.
Is this just a question of a bunch of, liberals who grew up in the 70s with the sort of hippie era, kind of now becoming middle-aged and wanting to critique companies, or is there something more, profound going on?
Well, sort of looping back, as they become middle-aged, they sort of go back to their critique of the 60s. I think there may be some of that happening, but I think there's something much more real going on. There are several things going on here. Corporations, for competitive reasons, are trying to get rid of or off-put their health obligations to their employees. More and more people are paying higher co-pays and this sort of thing. This is pervasive, and people are grumbling about it. There are reasons why this is happening, but they're grumbling about it.
Well, there's a certain segment of the population would say it's high time the government got out of these areas and that people stopped relying on big corporations and became more independent, and aren't we lucky to have money that we can invest ourselves and not rely on other large institutions? Is there
Absolutely.
Not some positive side to this?
There is a whole economic argument about this, and in some ways I agree with it. Corporations in Europe, in Japan, and elsewhere don't have these health obligations. The state does. Be that as it may, we have a society where corporations have in fact been doing this, and as they pull back, people are getting mad. Okay. And that's just one of the reasons why people are kind of angrier at corporations. Also, a lot of investors lost a lot of money during the bursting of the bubble. And part of that was the bad behavior of CEOs in Enron and Tyco. And it's very, they're very unforgiving, and they should be unforgiving. There was a lot of bad corporate behavior for 3 or 4 years, and that also has infected the atmosphere.
Now, the defenders of the corporate world will say, yeah, there were a few bad apples, but there's no problem with the way that corporations function in society, and that this is really getting overblown. What would you say to that?
Well, for a lot of corporations, it's true. For a lot of other corporations, it's not quite true. There's still a good deal of bad behavior in companies. Take a look at Disney. 45% of Disney's shareholders voted to get rid of the CEO, and Disney's board is supposed to represent the shareholders. He's there. He's been there for a long time. He probably should have been gone a long time. And all the people who invest in Disney are quite upset. There are millions of people who are upset. This is real. So the problems that we had for a whole bunch of years after the bubble burst are still with us, and a lot of people know that. And it's up to corporations and the various parts of corporations, the CEOs, the boards, to do something. And when they don't do it, they are rightly criticized.
What are the consequences of the fact that in our popular culture, we have a Super Size Me movie which criticizes, the fast food companies, and we have the media being criticized for being oligopolistic, where you don't have a range of opinions? What is the consequence to our culture of people feeling like all these big bad entities are out there?
Well, again, it's good to contrast this with the 90s, where a lot of people, particularly a lot of young people, really associated themselves with the corporate world, or certainly with the business world. They wanted to be part of it. They thought it was cool. They thought it was, working in a small company particularly, or even working in a big, cool company, was like sort of joining a commune. You spent all your time there, you brought your dog there, you met your mates there. It was a great thing. It was really positive. And now it's not like that at all. There is a sense of, well, you got to work, and you got to work there, and you do your thing and they do their thing, but there's a real distance here, and there's no real loyalty on either side. This is very important.
It's a huge cultural shift if you have an anti-business sentiment in a country that has long time been devoted to generating wealth. This whole premise of the shareholder society is based on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very threat to America's corporate culture and its business culture and its future growth. And steps have been taken. We could talk about this. There have been. Arthur Andersen was killed as a company for its sins, and we could argue whether that was good or not. But there has been a lot of reform coming out of the Bush administration over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of change, a lot of punishment, and I think in some sense that has helped somewhat. Not quite, but stuff has happened. And if you look at Duck Corporation, the movie, you get a sense of corporations being out of control, rogue corporations. I think that is really overstated. There has, in fact, been a lot of regulation, new regulation, Sarbanes-Oxley, a lot of stuff coming out of Washington and out of the states, particularly New York State, that have reformed a great many corporate behaviors. And I think that's positive. But we still have a distaste, I think, in the society of a bad taste about corporations that hasn't changed very much. We're certainly not back to the love fest that we had in the 90s with business and corporations, and that's a problem.
Well, and I think if you look back even historically to, a time in the 20th century where we had the big trusts that were having to be broken up, there was a great concern about monopolistic power, economic power in this country. And I think people at this point are very concerned that corporate power has gone too far. What specifically, what other ways could we make companies more accountable to the general population? Is that possible? Is that a viable goal? Well,
I think there are a few things that should be done, that haven't been done and really should be done. We don't have a real antitrust policy in this country. And we really need one. We need it for growth, we need it for competition, we need it for markets, and under both Democratic and Republican administrations, they've sort of redefined the meaning of antitrust and basically have allowed oligopolies, monopolies. I don't have to name the companies, but I think we have one of the worst cell phone systems in the world. We have a third world cell phone system. You could be on a river in India or China and call anywhere in the world. You could be in Manhattan and not get can't call anywhere. And that's because of monopoly or oligopoly. And we have a pretty, it's changing now. But our software hasn't changed in 20 years, and that's partly because of monopoly.
Have a dominant company.
Yeah, and we really need a much more vigorous antitrust thing, and that would take care of a lot of the problems. We also need boards of directors to be much more responsible, and we've got to get rid of all the crony boards that are appointed by CEOs. A lot of progress has been made, but there are still a lot of boards who let a lot of things go on, and they're getting money, they're getting paid, they're doing business. This is basically corruption, and that has to be changed, and soon.
Do you see some sign of that happening?
Yeah.
A little bit here, a little bit there.
Yeah, I don't see any. For a couple of when things were really bad with Tyco and Enron, we saw a lot of broads scurrying. But
you hear a lot of rhetoric.
Yeah, and there were some actually made some changes, but it's really settled down, and people they're grumbling. There's a pushback from corporate America now saying, these regulations are too much, they're interfering, da-da-da. The boards are sort of saying, don't bug me, it's not a responsibility. No. We need a lot more activity, a lot more action with the boards and boards of directors.
If you take on the antitrust laws, you're going to get a lot more regulation. I mean, everybody would say, well, all of this new activity is because we had deregulation. There was a feeling that things had gone too far, that the government was intervening too much in the marketplace and let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah.
We had the airlines be deregulated. Now we look at that industry. Is there now going to be a greater acceptance, do you think, as we see this anti-corporate sentiment growing, to maybe let the government play a larger role? That would be a big change too.
Well, I think there has been a sea change in terms of how people perceive government, partly because of 9/11. And partly because of the huge wave of reform that followed corporate corruption. There was a lot of legislation that came to be, and people, I think, the whole concept of government is a problem, that's pretty much gone now.
Not if you listen to the Bush administration.
Well, the Bush administration has been, behind Sarbanes-Oxley. It's been behind killing a whole corporation. The accounting firm, Arthur Andersen. They talk a good line, but they have in fact been very responsible for the largest expansion of government and regulation since Ronald Reagan in the last 20 years. So there's quite a disjunction between rhetoric and reality with the Bush administration. A lot of people don't talk about that, but it's really true.
And it will be an issue, I think, in the election.
Hasn't so far.
No?
I don't see it, but the Democrats don't seem to be able to get traction on anything, even on this. So I don't see it at all. And also, I would argue that we haven't really seen deregulation, certainly when it comes to the big phone companies who are, from my point of view, totally responsible for the miserable cell phone system that we have.
Sensing a theme here, Bruce.
Well, they kept out all the competition. They went to the courts and da-da-da, and in fact they got larger, and they were able to keep out all the new companies. We had so many new companies that came up, and if we had allowed real competition, we would have had a much better cell phone system and a much better economy, certainly a telecom economy. But they kept their hold, and that was a case of not enough deregulation. Yeah.
We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Business Week's editorial page writer, Bruce Nussbaum. Bruce, you and I have both seen a film called The Corporation that is, I think, in its 4th or 5th hit month in a small film theater in Lower Manhattan. It's a very radical critique of the company's existence, and what it basically posits is it's required by companies to focus solely on the pursuit of profit in order to benefit their shareholders. It's a legal requirement. And therefore, it creates entities that really don't care what the impact is on their society. Do you think that's a fair statement about the way a company runs? And what are the problems with that if it's true?
I think my problem with that critique is that the movie was clearly done by people who haven't really worked inside corporations for a very long time. I mean, theoretically, it's true. Corporations exist solely to make profits for shareholders. Okay. But in reality, if you've looked at corporations over the last 100 years, 150 years, they've also been associated with creation of enormous amounts of wealth, true, profits, that they've been forced to, or cared to choose to, share with any number of people, including their employees. And it's very hard to say that the rise of the corporation in the last 100 years is somehow divorced from the rise of the middle class and the rise of wealth in most of the U.S., Europe, around the world. They're not. And clearly, a lot of the profits that have in fact been generated by the corporation have in fact gone to employees, have in fact gone to investors, shareholders. They've gone out into the world. They've gone into pension funds. They've gone into salaries. They've gone out. And so I think it's a very primitive critique to simply say, well, they're only interested in profits. Well, you've got to see where those profits go. And a lot of those profits have, in fact, and varies from year to year and decade to decade, they have, in fact, gone out to employee salaries, employee pensions, taxes, revenues to government, all this sort of thing. So I think it is an unfair critique. It's a simplistic critique. It's not quite unfair, but it's simplistic.
It goes a little bit further than that, though, in saying, well, we're not saying corporations aren't sometimes doing good things. But again, the critique of the film is they only do good things to the extent that they figure it'll enhance their profits. And they're only allowed to do good things. That's Milton Friedman, is I believe even quoted in the film, is saying it's totally illegitimate for a corporation to do things that would consciously benefit a community that it works in or its worker base, unless they can demonstrate to themselves that it also enhances their profits.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a great line in The Big Chill, one of my favorite 60s movies, about money. And one of the characters asks another character, they're now in their 30s, you know, well, you know, why aren't we rich, you know, by now? And the other guy says, well, we grew up in the 60s when money was considered evil. And I think part of the critique is an assumption that if you have an organization that's solely, you know, modeled and focused on making profits, somehow that's bad, somehow that's evil. And they don't actually take the next step in the movie, but it's implied that if you're only interested in making profits, somehow that's not a good thing. And I would say, well, you know, it depends on what you do with the profits. And in fact, corporations are a pretty good money-making machine. They're better than anything else we've come up with. And it really depends, again, on what you do with the profits. You know, you could tax some of it and then put it into education or defend yourself against terrorists. You can share it with your employees. You could give it out to your investors. So, okay, you see where I'm getting?
Yeah,
you know,
you're saying the institution itself isn't the problem.
No, I don't think so. I mean, most institutions aren't problems. I mean, I guess you could come up with some of them that are, but this particular one isn't.
I think the problem that I sense from talking to a lot of employees out there is that they feel that the choices have narrowed as the corporation has gotten more powerful. The choice of our food that we eat is increasingly narrowing. The choice of the music that we hear, the kinds of shows that we get to see on television, the logos everywhere, the advertising, the marketing. A lot of people, I think, are turning off from a culture that is so dominated by such a handful of companies who have a very particular agenda. Yeah. And they're seeking, whether they're trying to support small businesses, products that they don't see in the mainstream because it's refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I think Norman Mailer is talking about when he says, you know, the big empty. There's sort of this feeling that we're being spiritually, aesthetically, culturally diminished by this rise of this very strong corporate culture that has no accountability or very limited accountability.
Well, there are two different things. I think one is the rise of corporate culture and its encompassing civil society and our culture in general, and that is a real issue. And I would argue that we have to make tremendous efforts to keep the economy open, to keep the society open, so that you can go to a Whole Foods and get organic food, okay? If you don't like...
Or read a blog that gives you a different perspective on a media issue.
Exactly. Or go downtown if you're in New York to Nolita and get your clothes, you know, and not buy them at the Gap, and get them at, you know, some women's or guy's shop where they make their own, with their own sensibility. And I think as long as that exists and that's open and it's healthy, and I think actually in America it really is. If you don't like Starbucks, if you're out in the West Coast, go to Pete's, you know. I wish we had a Pete's in New York. But as long as these things, as long as there's dynamism and mobility and change and choice, I think it's fine, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing is accountability. And that I'm quite worried about because I see money playing such an enormous role in Washington these days in terms of regulation, in terms of lobbying, in terms of everything. And corporations, of course, have an enormous amount of money. And unions, because of their decline, have much less. And there's, you know, you just don't see checks and balances going here. And that concerns me a bit more. You just need checks and balances. That's how our system was set up. And I'm concerned that we're not seeing that within the polity, within the political system.
Well, I do think that people now believe that corporate America has so many inroads into Washington power circles that the rest of us are helpless.
Well,
I mean, Halliburton is sort of in the Manchurian Candidate, it's assumed to be the company in question. And I think that's because people have become increasingly cynical, and they're turning away from the political system, partly because of this corporate influence.
That may be true. I think that is true that a lot of people, particularly younger people, maybe not even particularly younger people, feel alienated, more and more alienated from it. And that is a real concern. You know, one of the things that's happened, and it's hard to talk about this without sounding partisan, but you could do this in sort of an academic way, was in the 90s, even in the 80s and the 90s, you saw the rise of a different kind of economy, the new economy. Okay. We saw the rise of a thinking economy based on, you know, computers and the internet and intellectual
knowledge workers.
Knowledge workers. Thank you very much. And knowledge companies, you know, Apple and all this sort of thing. And then you had in the election of 2000 a return to power of the old companies, of the extractive companies, the oil companies, the old military-industrial complex companies, and they became much more powerful in Washington than they were for the previous 20 years. And I think a lot of the criticism, a lot of what's happening, and a lot of the criticism has to do with this kind of shift of power away from what seemed to be the more progressive dynamic, back to companies that are used to operating in a very behind-the-scenes, very close with with government kind of way. And I think that has made things a lot worse.
So maybe there's actually even some tension within the corporate sector between the sort of newer, more entrepreneurial, the Amazons, the eBays that's kind of represented this era that you're describing, and the old guard represented by the Business Roundtable. Many of those companies have fallen into disrepute because of corporate scandals, accounting scandals, excessive CEO pay. So maybe there's even some tension within that sector.
Oh, absolutely. I think there are real splits within corporate America, within the culture.
It's
splits,
not monolithic.
You know, it's not monolithic. It never was. And I think in the 90s we certainly saw a real division. And in many ways, they're much more, the new stuff, the new economy companies are more dynamic, more powerful, more growth-oriented. They generate more jobs. But with the election and with the turn of events and we've seen you could call it an atavistic return to corporations and corporate culture that do business in a different way, and I think have generated a lot of antagonism.
Will this election change that at all? Do you see these forces playing out at all during this election?
Oh yeah, I think
there is. It matters who wins in terms of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're working for Cisco or eBay, you don't want you don't want Utah or Moab or any of those, or Alaska or Central Park or the Grand. You don't want any of these things marred by drilling. You just don't think that our problems can be solved by drilling. You would want new technology to come up with our energy problem. That's how you approach, the world, and that's how you want to live your life. You want to have these places free and clear for you to do biking, and then you want new technology to solve the conservation, and generate conservation. If you're from sort of a frontier culture, Texas culture, where you exploit the land and you're used to this, well, you see the world in a very different way. And I think those folks are now in power and are basically running the country and in that fashion. We all kind of project from our culture, and I think that's what you see now. And there's a huge conflict.
I mean, I think if I was in a large corporation and I was thinking about recruiting the next generation of workers, I'd be very concerned about the image of the American company. I think it's perhaps getting harder and harder to attract certain kinds of people into this world because they go, it's bureaucratic, it's corrupt, there's not a soul to it, I don't want to be part of it. And I think that we're potentially risking losing some people from that work culture.
Oh, I think you're right. I think it's a long-term threat to U.S. prosperity and growth unless it changes.
Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. We've been very fortunate to have Business Week's editorial page writer, Bruce Nussbaum, as our guest today. We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Insensitive, uncaring, liars, thieves. These are words one wouldn't expect to hear aimed at companies. Yet the disenchantment that is developing in certain circles about corporations runs far deeper. Today, critics argue that corporations' relentless pursuit of profit has led to the degradation of the environment, the dehumanization of work, and the undermining of everything from the food we eat to the music and TV shows laced with product placements that we consume. Even the drugs our doctors prescribe have become suspect. The question is this simply a fad? The inevitable backlash after the highly publicized failures of Enron and the like? Or are the germs of a serious challenge to the dominant corporate culture beginning to emerge, facilitated by technology and a revival of entrepreneurship? America's CEOs would do well to pay attention. It could get harder for them to recruit the best people, to sell just any product as long as they blanket the airwaves with ads, to dominate the markets they go after. Corporatism and capitalism, after all, are not the same thing. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.